I thought it was really interesting that Rod brought up the example with Flatiron, because I was actually at a conference last week where Pfizer's VP of real-world data and analytics brought up this example. And so we keep hearing about real-world evidence, and I'd love to get the panel's view of how we're incorporating this into either new practices or changing outcomes. And maybe since we have the connection with Flatiron, Bobby, you could start first.
Yeah, and Rod, thank you I'm glad to hear you guys talk about that a lot, because we talk about it a lot internally too. It was an exciting story for us. I think that's a great example of where you can leverage the care that goes on every day. And effectively, the story that happens here is you have a drug that's approved for women in breast cancer. It's not on label for men with breast cancer. There's not a ton of data for that, but you're faced with a male with breast cancer who has breast cancer. You think the drug may be active, so in reality, it gets used off label. Mm-hmm. And what typically happens, and it's actually one of the sort of frustrations that got me into my current role, is you make these decisions in clinical practice and you learn something about that one patient, and that becomes anecdote. Mm-hmm. And you have lots of doctors all over with anecdote, and then it sort of goes off into the ether. So how do we take that information and make it useful? And I think that this is sort of the perfect example, and not the only example, of taking a drug that did not have an FDA label for this indication and leading it to have an FDA indication. So I think one of the real spaces where real-world evidence can help is in getting drugs that are already out there to patients sooner, make them available, make it easier for them to get paid for, which an FDA label will do. And then a whole lot of other use cases to understanding post-marketing, how drugs work, helping develop clinical trials, and ultimately to think, how do we sort of, and this is, I think, the hardest part, get that data in almost real time back to patients and clinicians at the point of care, and sort of the real model of a learning healthcare system.
Jeff, do you have a similar view? How's it different from the product side?
Yeah, so Fresenius is very highly integrated from insurance all the way through to a manufacturer of products. And we're in an exciting time where we're trying to transition the site of care more to the home. So we get involved a lot in the direct-to-patient marketing aspect of that, and looking at their social media footprint to try to find patients that we can educate about their options. So we're a little different headed in the direction, but I think as we start to combine those databases and have access to that information, we can do a much better job about educating patients on their options.
That's great. Aimee?
So we at Ochsner are really focused on, we're a healthcare delivery system, but really focused on delivering health and not just health care, which is a huge pivot, I think, in the system as we start moving to value-based care. And my team is really focused on demonstrating the value of new care models in the real world. And which gets to thinking about some of the issues around data, right, and how broadly are we viewing data. We obviously focus on the clinical data sets that we're used to looking at in healthcare, but what we need to think much more holistically to all the determinants of health, and that's an area where we have been collecting and intervening for 5+ years, really thinking about how the environment, how behavior, and now how genetics really factor into that, and getting that into clinical care, not as a research project. And then 2, you can think about that as, how do we connect that to other stakeholders to advance new learning, new thinking more quickly? And so that's an example of what Rod spoke about, some of the work we're doing with Pfizer about how can we accelerate clinical trials by using data sets that we already have, that we're already collecting, so we're not duplicating, so that we're using tools like FHIR to really allow for seamless data exchange, to advance clinical trials, to have new therapies reach patients more quickly, and really to make the experience better for patients at the end of the day, because in a trial setting, just as one example, or really in any care setting, it tends to be kind of paternalistic or not as participatory as I think it needs to be if we really want health to be the outcome, and I think we do. And so how do we engage patients more by sharing information that is actionable to them and seeing how that can actually change their behaviors? And I think these are some of the really exciting things ahead as we move into kind of new areas.
You spoke about the social determinants of health, and it seems that everybody's doing some work on this front. How do you loop that into an oncology practice?
Yeah, so there's some things you just don't get. I mean, you can get demographic information and zip code information, things whether people don't have access to food or don't have access to transportation. That information actually doesn't widely exist, and it certainly doesn't easily exist at the point of care. I think a lot of the ways people have started to think about this are there are a bunch of companies out there that are building risk stratification tools and decision support where those social determinants of health play a role. Patient-reported outcomes obviously feeds into that as well. I think we're still sort of the early days of seeing that get fully integrated into care. I think more broad, generally I wouldn't say it's a miss, but we have a long way to go in that space.
You agree, Jeff?
Yeah, I was saying, I think that's the first baby step, but then translating that information and guiding a patient towards the direction that you want for the outcome you're intending and all the intervention and aspects. We found that there's really, in transitioning to the home environment, there's two things that are valuable to a patient. One is confidence. Imagine taking on a therapy for yourself. You really want to have a lot of self-confidence that you can do this and do it successful. So anything you can do to improve their confidence. And the other is burden. If we can provide a pathway that's less burdensome than the traditional environment, then we can direct their behavior to where we want to go. So it's translating that information into the expected behavior through guidance. For instance, reducing burden. We look at the weather forecast, and we try to prepare our patients for a hurricane or a weather event by sending information to them. Is your safety kit ready? Do you have the supplies you need? So advanced warning that they don't have to worry about those things. So it gives them more confidence and it reduces the burden for them. And I think that's really a critical process of how do you translate that data into the expected behavior and what are you trying to drive? Because both of those drive better clinical outcomes in our experience.
So yeah, if you think about one, you have to get the data, first of all. That's like step one, right? And it's a lot of information. Now, obviously we now have a lot of digital tools where we can collect behavior, environmental data, you name it, and really have better insight on specific patients' needs. Because really at the end of the day, what we're trying to deliver back is a personalized experience at an N of 1 level, but you've got to do that at scale by collecting, large data sets and then applying the algorithms in the background to be able to process it and get it back down to an individual level. So one, you have to begin by collecting it, and then two, kind of use the capabilities that we have in analytics to be able to drive those personalized insights. But the power of being able to predict and personalize care and then prevent things from happening is really powerful. We're seeing that in chronic disease care at Ochsner and some of the things that we're doing by taking this sort of holistic approach and understanding that we can empower patients with information that is specific to them. Patients with respiratory issues who might receive a text alert based on air quality conditions that we've begun collecting very specific areas near their home, near where the patient is, and being able to let them know maybe you should stay inside for the next couple of hours. That's empowering, and that's also helping with health at the end of the day. And so we're really thinking about how can we take these large insights and then deliver them back to individual people and make sure that they're able to act and change their behaviors in such a way to help produce their health.
And go ahead.
Yeah, well, we hadn't met each other, and one of our first conversations was talking about source of data and interoperability of data, because that's the bedrock of these quality predictions and then changing the behavior. So we all have different experiences relative to that.
That's a good segue into what are the challenges around interoperability, and I think we all recognize that there's holes in what you guys are trying to do, and there's areas that can be improved. But where do you see interoperability improving, and where do you think we still have a long way to go? Anybody can start.
So it's interesting. We sort of see the world, and we were talking about this before, from two perspectives. So we own an electronic health record. So we have lots of other people who want to have interoperability with our software. And then we have software that integrates with other EHRs. So we sort of see it from both sides. I think the tone has definitely changed in the world. Like, people understand that they have to do this. Our perspective is there have been just a lot of operational challenges in this space. So we have worked with large EHRs at hospitals that our clients work with, and we want to have interoperability with our electronic health record, and they're willing to do it, but it takes work, and it will be a year and a half before that gets on the roadmap. So our physicians aren't able to see when their patients get hospitalized at this hospital. So the technology exists to do it, maybe not as seamlessly as you would like. There is no strong incentive for the hospital to do that in this circumstance. If you assume best intent, they just don't have the bandwidth to do it, and it just doesn't get prioritized. And then the other challenge that we see as an EHR vendor is, the move towards interoperability. And by the way, I think OMB is in the midst of reviewing the rules so that the data blocking rule, information blocking rules are going to come out any day. But one of the things we worry about is, okay, so now there's going to be 1 million different apps to integrate with our EHR, and security concerns, and doing the right thing for the patient concerns, and doing that without being viewed as information blocking. So it's the whole sort of menu of things we worry about and are excited about.
Yeah, and I think the other way to think about it is, one, we think about how can we use it to impact patients, but then how can patients have it, right? And in a way that is useful to them. And I think there have been, Apple certainly been pushing this along by trying to create more access through Health App, but to think about what does it look like for patients at the end of the day to really be able to be empowered with information, not overwhelmed with information, which is very possible in this space. But when we think about interoperability, I think we have to really think down to what does it look like for a patient and someone who is trying to make decisions about their health, about their family's health every day. And that needs to be the goal, I think, as we think about interoperability, get it to the ground.
Yeah, I think we at Fresenius have had this unique window into some aspects of this because we're a full risk insurance company all the way through. So, that's the starting point of seeing everything that's going on because you're paying the bills. Right. But that's not the full picture. We also have the luxury of treating those patients in a chronic environment. So we provide the lab services. So now we've got the clinical information. So it's given us a different picture than most, which says, we have a sense of where the opportunity that we're talking about, but that data interoperability is critical. But it's also the value that everybody's trying to capitalize on, is what's the business model that gets generated out of that data and the understanding of that data. So there's a tension there that is, I think, getting significantly better, but we're not where we all need to be.
Well, with that point, with the idea that there's a business model there, who do you think is doing, or what kind of services are very innovative that are kind of trying to tackle that problem? Is there anything that comes to mind?
In which specific part?
The opportunity to leverage some of this data into maybe a new business model around the idea of taking down those hurdles in the interoperability spectrum, if you will. A lot of buzzwords in there.
There's always a lot of buzzwords.
Yeah, this one's rich in buzz.
So from our perspective in the interoperability world, the people that we think we get approached by most are patient engagement tools. So how do you help an oncology practice risk stratify, identify patients who are most in need of interventions, who are at high risk of having complications of chemotherapy, who are going to be at high risk of going into the hospital? A ton of companies in that space want to integrate with the EHR, provide dashboards for clinicians and nurses as they're taking care of patients. I'd say that's the one that we see the most. We have not seen a lot of specifically patient engagement tools outside of our own portal that we build, though I do think we're in the really early days of patient engagement. I think the nice thing about interoperability is there will be a lot of other players in the space, and I think it's more than just giving data to patients. You have to give data to patients in a way that's going to be useful, and it's not just going to be filled by medical jargon that's sort of irrelevant to them. How do you? But for us, it's been mostly the patient engagement triage stuff, I think.
Well, Aimee, you mentioned Apple, and we were at this conference last week, and Facebook was announcing, a product that they have. How do we think about, or how do you guys think about big tech and where they're going to play in healthcare in the future? Is it going to really be on the patient front, or are they going to, slowly creep into, the more provider-like settings?
So I think it remains to be seen. I think, we're seeing a lot of signal coming out from various groups, obviously, where Amazon's going with some of the PillPack acquisition and things like that seem to make sense with their existing business model. And I think, when you think about Alexa and using voice as a tool and some of the capabilities that those might do, Google leveraging not only their search tools, but obviously their data, considering how much information they have about health signal that they have. Apple, Tim Cook has been very clear that they think the biggest impact that Apple will contribute to society is in the healthcare space. So that coming from Apple, considering the impact that they've already had, is pretty significant. We've worked with Apple, we've worked with others, and really think that we've got to start thinking a little bit more broadly about how we can work together. So I think I'm glad that there are new entrants in the space. I think we have a lot of work to do in this industry. One of the things we were talking about at the conference last week is that there was some discussion about, is digital going to cause more of a divide? And I was like, there's already a divide.
Yeah.
There's already such a divide where people have access to care and people that don't, and things that don't. So I welcome, and I think we welcome new interest, to push us to go, because we can't accept the status quo anymore. We've got to, the transition to value-based care that's underway will be important to helping us advance health, the focus on driving some of this cost down, but really understanding some of the key drivers of that, like chronic disease, and really what we can do to change that and make care more accessible for everybody is really exciting. And so anybody that wants to come in and kind of push us all to think differently and to think more about better outcomes for everybody, that's a welcome change.
You guys feel the same way?
I do. I think the effect that they'll likely have is that they'll commoditize the tools and make it far more cost effective and more advanced to do it. So I'm not sure that's the core of value creation. I think the value creation might end up being down the supply chain, if you will, closer to the patient, where you can translate that knowledge, that information that can come out of those tools that they're all building into changing the course of care and capturing that's really where the dollar value is, in my opinion.
Yeah, I was just asking both you guys, and we don't see a ton of it yet, but telehealth and care at home seems to be a huge thing, or those areas that sort of serves the ability to keep people from having to come to the office, and it's both sort of a process thing as well as a technology as well. Do you guys see a lot of that, or have you leveraged telehealth at all?
Yeah, we actually do it now.
Yeah.
And so we worked with Apple. We have an application that's patient-centered in the home that allows for care team to telehealth in and do visits. And that's a unbelievably fast-changing environment. And the new regulations that were just codified for CMS coming next year is opening up a new window to allow site of care to change, so we can actually bill for telehealth, or our partners can.
Yeah.
So that's
and
just
we're
changing so
likewise,
fast.
we're doing a lot in the home, and I think our vision is we need to move more care into the home, or the point of care needs to be wherever the patient is. And if you start thinking about where, and I keep going back to chronic disease in part because it's, it affects most people in this country. It's 75% of deaths relate to chronic disease, 86% of healthcare costs are related to chronic disease. It's a big issue, and we've really got to think about it differently. And we have been really thinking about how do we take it out of our four walls, where patients might come in 3 or 4 times a year and spend, a 15-minute doctor's visit. How do we create more of a continuous relationship where people who are making decisions that impact their health, whether they move, what they eat, all of the things, all the way down to social isolation and socioeconomic conditions. How do we support patients in those decision points, those 8,700 hours when they're living their life and not in our doctor's office? That means we have to go into the home and support them there, and we have to understand them better and provide better support there. And so we've been doing that in hypertension and diabetes for almost 5 years now, and the outcomes are better. We're seeing higher levels of control, 3 times over usual care. Patients love it. Doctors love it. We figured out how to, be able to change kind of behaviors on that as well. And we're seeing reductions in cost by using kind of new tools and thinking about how do we think expansively about how do we connect people where they are. And so I think that's the way of the future. I think reimbursement models have a long way to go to catch up with that in the right way to help incentivize everybody to do that. But I feel like we've got proof that it works. And then at one point that you said about your question around the big tech companies. there is a lot of focus. I see they're kind of moving to the front door, which is those early needs, right? Beginning with search or urgent care or what are those things? And there's a lot of activity in the space. How do we pick people off in that kind of front door just when you're beginning to need care, maybe on the less acute setting? And I think there's a lot of interest both from big tech and startups in kind of disrupting that and then controlling the patient flow from there is sort of a big area where I think you're seeing a lot of the new entrants going into.
Jeff, you brought up something interesting about the tools that we have to look at data and use data. And I think we're inundated with AI and machine learning and natural language processing. Where do you guys think we are in terms of using those tools to improve outcomes? And what needs to happen to make those maybe more common or more valuable going forward?
The early data is amazingly encouraging. We see a 20% reduction in hospitalization through our connected health offering, and it's making it easy, making them lowering the burden, all those things. But virtualizing that care network in the home around the patient and enhancing what we can do for them is really leading. We have a lower drop rate on therapy. We have a lower hospitalization rate. So that's why I was leaning towards, I think that point of care is where the value creation, because those are huge dollars when you look at that side versus the analytics side. We're right at the starting line because I'm not sure we even know how to systematically translate the information we're getting into directing pathways of care. And I think that's where the big evolution will come over the next few years.
Yeah, we think it's really exciting. We get a little bit worried that it gets overhyped. I mean, you hear that it's easier to win Jeopardy than cure cancer, right? So, and to the point Rod made before, one of the things you worry about is bias. And if you do AI on a biased data set, you're just going to perpetuate discrepancies and things and disparities and things like that. So we do worry a lot about that. We've actually used AI at Flatiron for a variety of things to help with defining cohorts of patients, to help in identifying patients for some clinical trial matching. But we still find there's a lot, it's medical information and you're going to make clinical decisions on it. You have to layer on often a lot of manual people or clinical expertise. And going back to what I said before, the vision of a learning healthcare system where the care delivered gets translated into data, becomes knowledge back at the point of care. It's just really hard to do that because you always risk introducing bias if you're trying to make any comparisons. And we'll be out there and hear companies talk about, well, we're going to use AI, and in your practice, you're going to be able to see, are the doctors who are treating the patients with A getting better results than the patients with B? And if so, the practice should start using A. And there's just so much bias inherent in that there's just really the risk of making wrong decisions. And so those are the things that both excite us and also worry us. So.
Do you see the same thing at Ochsner?
Yeah, so I think one of the things you asked the question around, where are we in the AI? It is obviously this hype word, and I think it can be impactful. We've seen it be impactful because we are approaching it not as a research project or a nice to have. It's like, how do we get it to the point of care, which means we start thinking about what does it look like on the ground with a doctor, with a patient, and how can it be applied as opposed to starting with the science and is it possible and what is the model? And so for us, there's a lot of interesting discussion about it, a lot of interesting research about it, but for us is to start with how can it really change a life and then kind of build backwards from there and to see what could be the outcome. So like we've seen reductions. We've had several use cases where we've used machine learning in our hospital where we can predict codes. So respiratory failure, cardiac arrest, those are serious events that you want to prevent, and we can reduce those. We've shown reductions by 44% by using machine learning interventions in the floor. Same thing with hospital-acquired infections and things like that. We've been able to reduce significantly these conditions by using ML tools, but we start, and we've used NLP and other use cases as well. How can we do this? But we have to start by thinking about what does this look like on the ground with real people in the real world and not as a research project. And that's, I think, when people start thinking that way, that's when we can really start seeing the power. And I think that's kind of what you were suggesting. That's when we'll start seeing the power of this at more impact and more scale.
I think we only have about 5 minutes left, so I just wanted to get from the panel your thoughts and some predictions. Rod started us off. What do you think is going to be the most surprising thing when we think about technology 5 years from now? What'll surprise us? I mean, you brought up telehealth, and I think in our discussion earlier, we talked about that in a little more detail. But what other areas do you see that might surprise us 5 years from now that we're not necessarily, or we're scraping the surface today?
I think we're going to see real-world evidence and real-world data sort of transform the world of drug development. And one of the things that we're really excited about at Flatiron is there's this world of retrospective real-world data, and how do you layer on prospective data that you can collect sort of alongside clinicians as they're taking care of patients in a way that can leverage technology to make that easy for physicians to incorporate the patient voice using patient-reported outcomes to potentially layer on genomic information that gives you insight. So I think sort of my bias of 5 years from now is real-world data, real-world evidence is going to be, we'll still have the retrospective pool, but we'll have a lot more prospective as well.
That's great. Jeff?
Yeah, I think we'll see great progress in what I call the nuts and bolts as we transition to different care models and other sites of care, connectivity, ease of connectivity, all the infrastructure things that can enable our ability to execute this model. And I think in the end, it's going to be not the data scientists that win, it's going to be the behavioral scientists that win on this one, because that's who's going to end up translating the knowledge that we're gaining from the data into the behavior on the ground. And I think that's the tougher nut to crack.
Sure.
I'm excited. There are a couple things. I think one, we can think about the site of care very differently. And I think in 5 years, and I think we're starting to see this. Just we've talked a little bit about getting care into the home and really thinking about just getting health integrated into people's everyday lives more purposefully. And I think we will see, less focus on telemedicine, like the term telemedicine. It'll just be what we do. And so what the timeline is for that, I don't know, but I hope that we're evolving towards that. And then two, I think the opportunity we have to really take a more holistic look at health and all of the components that go into that, including genetics and the possibility that's available now with the lower price and the greater access to that will continue to evolve over the next few years, and to really think about how can we use all of that information to be more predictive, to be more proactive, and ultimately deliver a more personalized, preventative, and participatory process at the end of the day. And I think that's where I think we're going, and I see a lot of pieces to come, of other actors trying to say, how can we put all those pieces together to really make a difference on health? And so that's what the value prop we're building towards.
Well, great. That was a very quick breakfast panel. I want to thank our panelists for their time. I hope everybody enjoyed the conversation. And I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Pfizer, for hosting this breakfast. There's more healthcare today. I believe we have CBS's Larry Merlo on stage later this afternoon, and Pfizer is going to be back as well. So thank you very much for your time, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.